about online learning and dyslexia, potentials and limitations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renata, and thank you very much for inviting me. I want to say a couple of things before I give my presentation. I want to, as well as thanking Renata and the conference for inviting me, I want to acknowledge that everyone in this room is an expert. Everyone. But we're an expert in different things, and I hope respectfully that some of what I say will be of interest to you. I would be astonished if there aren't many people who disagree with some of the things that I said, because our perspectives inevitably will vary. And I want to say in advance that I respect those differences, and I look forward to having a conversation which brings those together and moves us forward. And also I want to sincerely congratulate the people who worked on the project. I did spend half a day looking really closely at what's on the website. My Czech and Hungarian was not good enough to construe all of the personal statements that I encountered. But at least you know I found them, because I found them and I couldn't read them. So I was particularly pleased to encounter the ones that won the prizes a little while ago. I do need to say something about the fact that the term dyslexia is still problematic. I've been a visiting professor in the United States at Virginia Tech and at the University of Texas in Austin. And my friends in Texas are really unhappy when I say that I study dyslexia and I teach a master's module on dyslexia. I'm a high school English teacher who got interested in reading and then in computing. And in the days when I started, computing hadn't moved that far. I was working on my PhD in the 1970s. And in those days, the professor said, oh, we need, if you need a program to do a nested 3x4 analysis of variance, then write it. And you had to write the program to do that work over the weekend. And I had to write the program to analyze my own data. So things have changed quite a lot. But then I got into working in schools, and because I was a high school English teacher who got into teacher training, I was still only in my early 30s. I thought I must keep in schools to learn what's happening with technology. And so the first lessons I taught using a computer were in 1984, bringing a computer into the classroom. And in weather like this, driving to a school, your computer froze in the car boot, and it sometimes wouldn't load because there was too much condensation inside the circuits. The program that you were going to run with the kids took 6 minutes to load, and sometimes at the end of those 6 minutes, a number of question marks appeared on the screen, meaning that your program hadn't loaded. And those of you, I'm sure that's many of us, that work with kids in classrooms know that you haven't got 6 minutes when a lesson begins if you're working with secondary school kids on the bad side of town. So I learned a lot from those experiences. And then gradually I've worked on government projects evaluating technology in education, but I've also kept an interest in dyslexia. And I do find the term very useful, and I'm going to say something about why and the ways in which we use it. I need to say a little bit about that, because I don't think we can help students who have challenges in reading unless we know a little bit more about the nature of the challenge they're facing. But I'm using the term dyslexic. Really, this is my meaning number one. A student who has a reading problem related to poor alphabetic or phonological coding. For me, that's the standard way of understanding dyslexia. But also, because some people do find it problematic to use the word dyslexia at all. Many of you will know the work of Keith Stanovich. He says we can't differentiate between poor readers and dyslexic readers, the tests aren't sensitive enough, so it's not useful to use the word dyslexia. I disagree with him, but it's also helpful, I think, to simply say any student who is judged to have a major problem with reading, writing or spelling is included in what I'm going to say. And Chris Singleton at Hull did a lot of work in this area, and he reckoned it was a significant challenge for between 1 and 2% of students in my country. Again, just a quick word on what I think we're talking about, particularly in dyslexia. I've been very taken, and I've always followed the work of Baddeley, because people say dyslexics have a problem with short-term memory, and I think that's too vague. We need to understand what they're talking about. Baddeley, very celebrated, he was the Englishman who discovered that the brain is rectangular. But more importantly, he talked about what's happening when the brain is reading. And there are two things that are happening very, very quickly. Word recognition takes place in about 20 milliseconds, maybe 50 milliseconds in fluent reading. And then subvocalization, as we know, follows that. And in normal fluent reading, that's what happens, and it doesn't happen with those who have a problem with the phonological loop. And the result of that is that their word recognition is behind their comprehension. So we have two axes, language comprehension and word recognition. And my understanding of most cases of students who are described as dyslexic will be people who are in this quadrant, who are ahead on language, but behind on word recognition. But I don't think they're the only people who get called dyslexic. And I'm certain that in higher education, as in the general community, there are people who have problems in language comprehension as well as in word recognition. So poor reader, what Stanovich, I think, rather unpleasantly called a garden variety poor reader, is behind in both language comprehension and word recognition. There are some people who get identified as dyslexic who are in that area as well. But I want to differentiate them and talk about those two groups independently. So I'm calling one the language minus, the L minus dyslexic reader who's behind in language, and the L plus dyslexic reader who is the person that's more normally described or more usually described as dyslexic, who is ahead on language comprehension but behind on word recognition and almost certainly a poor speller. That then leads to two kinds of profile in particular. Now, of course, there are other aspects that people talk about comorbidity of students who are behind in other areas as well, in number recognition, in symbol recognition. I'm not going to focus on those. I'm going to look particularly at what I'm calling the L plus and L minus group. So up here you've got high language achievement, high intelligence, high on reading speed, but poor on reading accuracy, good vocabulary, excellent comprehension, and poor spelling. When I was a teacher beginning my job, I worked in a traditional school. We had a Bible reading every day. We don't see much of the Bible in schools in my country these days. And part of my job was to identify the poor soul who was going to read from the Bible the next morning. And I think one day the poor kid was trying to walk out the school and I hadn't fixed anybody. And I grabbed young Mapletoft and said, I'm going to ask you to read the Bible tomorrow morning. He said, oh, sir, don't. I hate reading. I hate reading. I knew he was one of the brightest kids in his year. And I said, it's only a short psalm. It's only 4 or 5 verses, and I know you can do it. So I gave him a Bible, and I said, practice this, and you'll be fine the next morning. Next morning, I opened the massive traditional school Bible on the massive lectern to the appropriate psalm, and the head teacher said, and now we'll have a reading of Psalm number so-and-so. And this kid went up to the podium. Unfortunately, his knowledge of Roman numerals was poor. And he began reading the wrong psalm. And he began reading Psalm 119, which is the longest psalm in the Bible. And he was therefore reading the wrong one. And what was absolutely fascinating was this. He was reading from the King James Version, which was published in the 17th century, but written in the 16th century. It was the Tyndale version that first appeared in English, as a result of which some people were burned. As you know, it was an important historical document. He read it in contemporary English. He translated it into today's English as he was reading it. When he came to a word he didn't understand, he processed the word, worked out what it ought to be, used his other knowledge, and paraphrased, and went on. And it was so interesting, I didn't rescue him until the head teacher looked at me, and everyone was thinking, how long is this going to go on for? And I stopped him reading. But he was the perfect case of L+. His high intelligence enabled him to paraphrase, work out what the word might be, and substitute for a word he didn't know, and substitute contemporary grammar when there was a phrase he didn't understand. So there's a perfect example of L+. L- is much nearer kids who have problems with everything in language. As we know, a vast amount of children's vocabulary and ability in their mother tongue is determined before they're 24 months old. We now know that much more of it than we realized before is in place by 12 months. Even though they're not uttering it, and you think there's very little grammatical knowledge there, a tremendous amount of it is in place in 12 months. It is the case that on different types of data, there are different studies we could quote here. Children under 2 in some environments are encountering 700 utterances a day in their lives, mostly from their parent. 700 utterances a day, and other kids on average are getting 11,000 utterances a day. That has a massive effect, of course, on their vocabulary and on their capability when they come to learn to read. And also, of course, it is the case that many of those kids do not live in environments where there are magnetic letters on the fridge and so on, all of those things we know about. But I didn't think many students with this kind of background, slower than average in reading, slower word recognition, poor vocabulary, poor comprehension, poor abstract conceptualization, my assumption was that, okay, there are people like that, they're not going to do well at school. They're not going to go to university. Wrong. Our gates are, thank goodness, becoming wider. The opportunities for studying are greater. And there are more students in the L- group now coming into universities, and we need to ask the question, how do we support the L- reader as well as the L+? These are a series of areas of competence, and I didn't have room on the slide to put all of them in. And so here is your even my daughter said, "Dad, you're not using the word normal, are you? That will upset everybody." I said, "Well, it's a kind of shorthand. We know what it means." So here is a normally achieving university student, certainly at the University of Vienna. High background knowledge, good vocabulary, rapid processing in the phonological loop, fast word recognition, and of course 3 things are happening in reading. Well, on this slide, 4 things. Word recognition, local comprehension, text integration. I'm very much following the Walter Kinch model of comprehension, and then a final comprehension. And the point I want to make is the different trajectories of the L plus and L minus student in getting towards comprehension. The L plus has good vocabulary and background knowledge, world knowledge, but poor processing in the phonological loop, leading to lower than average word recognition speed, slows up local comprehension, but by then comprehension is being facilitated by predictability in words and so on, and then the student, given time, can catch up on text integration and comprehension. But the task for the L minus student is even greater, because they're behind in vocabulary and in background knowledge and phonology. The word recognition is slowed up even more. Comprehension is tricky, and integration is tricky because there's less background knowledge to integrate with and more problems trying to hold things together. And I'm talking about real people. This is not just theory. I'm talking about one of my students on a Skype conversation at master's level saying, "Colin, I find it impossible to read and remember in order to understand the work that you're asking me to do." He's a sincere, a decent, lovely man, father of 2 young kids, and what he's wanting to do is to do master's level work, reading Brunner, reading Piaget, reading Vygotsky. Those are not easy people to understand. And he's saying, I can, I get 2 or 3 lines, and then I can't remember what happened 2 or 3 lines before that. He's asking me to help him. And then we're asking ourselves, how do we help him? What are some of the problems for dyslexic students in online learning? Now, of course, I recognise that I'm not suggesting you don't know this. I'm offering a perspective in which there may be some things that overlap and some things a little bit different to what you focus on. So please don't assume my assumption is you don't know anything here. I'm sharing my perspective and inviting you to set it alongside yours. Because there are reasons we might think the dyslexic student could do well in online learning, but the level of the material, as I was just saying, is very challenging. The volume of reading at master's level is certainly going to be challenging, and then there's a lack of group interaction, or the possibility of group interaction with online learning, and also you haven't got the social interaction. That you remember when you could sit on the back row and everyone could look at the lecturer and you say, well, I don't understand what they're saying, but what's more, who'd wear a shirt like that? That kind of bonding is very, very important, and emotional support, saying, well, who can understand this anyway? And then you go away and try and work on it. But as we know, there are some positives in looking at online learning, and many of those you talk about on this project. The students can learn at their own pace. There's no humiliating exposure of weaknesses in front of your peers, we hope. There's extra tutor support You can have Skype messages, you can have emails, you can look at the postings of your colleagues on a bulletin board, and their understanding, their stories, their contributions can be valuable. And then there's the online and offline tools that you've been working on this project, text-to-speech, speech-to-text, glossing, summarising, abstracting sources. They're getting more and more sophisticated, and there are more and more of them, and video material getting much more significant. One of the national projects I worked on, I was talking at ERA, at European Ed Research, in this city. I think it was 3 years ago, it might have been 4. And I talked about the difference in maths teaching when a maths teacher can teach the kids how to solve simultaneous equations, but then he's also posted on the internet a podcast of himself teaching that. So when you're doing your homework and you get stuck, you can go to that site and there's a teacher in your pocket, as it were, telling you again how to do it. And I suggested that the availability of that, 24/7 as it were, was fundamentally changing the authority relationship in education and changing teaching. I never finished my lecture because 3 colleagues from a German-speaking country, quite close to Austria, stood up and said, "Dr. Harrison, we fundamentally disagree, and we disagree so angrily we must challenge you." There is nothing new in what that teacher was doing. He was doing 19th century didactic teaching. He may have been doing it well, but we don't agree that it's fundamentally changing the nature of education. And we had the most wonderful, engaging conversation of this sort. If you don't feel threatened by it, you hope to have at an international conference. But the question is this, does that really help the online learner? And my suggestion is it can do. And then of course there's the text reformatting options which we've been talking about, that you've offered in terms of colour, format, font and so on. But I want to suggest that every one of these is problematic, and I think we know this. The young man with whom I was having the Skype conversation said, "The pace is too fast, there's too much to read, I haven't got time to do it, it takes me too long to understand. I need 4 times the time to do module 1, and there are 4 modules." And so we've reorganised that person's deadlines in order to help. No humiliating exposure of weaknesses in front of peers, that's not true. Because every student has to post online. They have to make postings. It's a non-assessed component in the course. We want people to be making a contribution, and this person is very, very unhappy about that because he feels his weaknesses are going to be shown up. There's extra tutor support. My tutor can't give me all the help I need. How much help does that guy need? I've got 20 students in that group, and I'm only teaching part-time now. Other people have got, face-to-face classes and all the important things. Today's half-day seminar on risk assessment that every professor now has to go on. All those things that make your day so much fun. His peers can't support him. The classmates have got their own anxieties. Text-to-speech, he does use it, but I discovered something. I've not seen any data on this. I'd love it if you can tell me a paper on this. My experience has been that text-to-speech is difficult to understand if you're a poor reader. it's not perfect. Unless it's all digitized speech, synthetic speech has got better and better. But my experience is that the L plus reader can understand synthetic speech. The L minus reader finds it harder to understand synthetic speech because they've got less to draw upon in understanding it, because it's not perfect. Unless you've got a good prediction of what's coming, it's much harder to understand any speech. Glossing and summarizing other sources, fine. The internet now contains vast amount of data. There are 25 million artifacts in the British Library. How many websites are there? 25 billion at the last count. And I've described that as a room with 25 billion doors. And you don't know what's on the other side of the door. And so we do know that poor comprehenders have difficulty judging the trustworthiness of sources. And we know it drives you mad when, you know, students writing a master's level and they, you know, I found this so-and-so.com site that makes the claim that if only people would ride horses more often, then their dyslexia would be cured. You know, they have a kind of strange way of identifying research trustworthiness. So I'm doing work in this area with 11-year-olds at the moment, and one of my colleagues at Rutgers University, top university in New Jersey, said, "Can I have your test, because I want to give it to the 20-year-olds that I'm working with, because they're having trouble judging the trustworthiness of websites." So I think that's a problem for us. Can I trust it? Can I cite it? And in what way does that, how do we use that material at university level? Text reformatting, I've been interested in that. My doctoral area was in readability and legibility. And yes, of course, it can help, and I applaud the work that's done in this area. But what my students say is that not all the texts that they are reading are editable. You can't grab all the text you have to read. Some of them are in sources where you can't download it, so then you can't change the format. So all of those become more and more difficult. I found this paper which opened my eyes from Rediker. Social computing tools, while supporting different learning paces and cognitive styles, let's not get into that argument. For what it's worth, I'm very, very cool towards the idea of learning styles. But I understand where Rediker is coming from. The point is that the different computing tools available are at the same time producing close to insurmountable barriers to students with cognitive disabilities in general and dyslexia in particular. So what he's saying is that, that for online learning, the student working on their own, it's actually more difficult these days than in face-to-face. Are there any good things that we can report? Well, there are one or two. In the popular press, many people believe that students who are spending all day on the phone are having their ability to write corrupted, their ability to spell correctly corrupted. No, that's not the case. And Claire Wood did some beautiful work in this area, showing that the kids who text most, who send the most texts, are the ones who are top in English in my country. And so it's not the case that it degrades your ability. Just as kids are able to swap linguistic registers in different verbal communication contexts, so they can swap different registers when it comes to texting. And what my kids said to me was, it's not so much about saving letters in order to send a brief or text. It's more having text which your parents can't understand. So when your kid is on Facebook or whatever, PIR, parent in room. They just send, as soon as you're in there, PIR. Then everything changes, you know. What are you doing next Saturday? But it doesn't damage their literacy level. Most of us are not producers of social media. Apart from texting, in terms of actually producing anything, only 6% of people are producing. One thing that is quite a piece of research that I thought was really interesting is this, that forums can negatively impact motivation and confidence, not just for poorer readers and writers. There was a lovely study done in Bristol of a project that was encouraging students to use social networking in an economics class, and the first student put up a posting on this bulletin board, and the professor wrote a comment saying, what a super posting, a really interesting article that you found, and really thoughtful comment on it. After that, silence. No other student posted. And so the professor came back and said, look everybody, I noticed that no one else is posting to the forum. Let me tell you that I encourage everyone to post. Don't worry if you make a complete fool of yourself. That was the final posting of the year. So now we have two rules. One is the professor says nothing, and certainly the professor doesn't, in effect, give a grade to the posting. And the other rule is make it unassessed but compulsory coursework if you want people to contribute to a forum. Then everyone will contribute. So that's, you can choose whether you go with that rule, but it's worked for some of our colleagues. But what are the limits to the help we should give? I'm calling the young man with whom I had my conversation, Tim. How much help should I give him? He's working at master's level. If he says, can I send you a draft of everything I write? I can say to him, okay, there are some major problems with your understanding of Len Vygotsky, as you call him. I've had Len Vygotsky from some people. They invent a name that they like. He is permitted to get help with his grammar and sentence structure from a friend. That's not breaking any university regulation. If I'm then helping him with his cognitive analysis, who's getting the degree? And then you say, well, isn't it my job to teach him? Yes. Is it my job to write his essays? No. But nevertheless, it raises the question, where does the boundary lie? And from our perspective of offering different kind of support mechanisms, I think there are issues that we need to discuss around where the ethics of support lie, and in terms of those boundaries. And one of my friends who's a maths lecturer said the purpose of an exam is to find out what a student can do in 3 hours. If we gave everyone 2 weeks, every student would get 100%. Well, he must have been working with some very bright students. I don't think we'd all get 100% in third year maths exam at university, even if we were given 2 years. But you can understand where he's coming from. You want an exam to assess certain things, and there's a limit to how much help you can give. what are the moral issues? What are the equity issues? Mavra, up at the top here, was a real student in my class 2 years ago. High language achievement, high intelligence. Her reading was good, her comprehension was good, but her reading speed was very slow. Her spelling was poor, and she took a long time over writing, and her confidence was low. She failed one paper for plagiarism, and I hate that. You know, I just found loads of what she'd written was copied and pasted straight from the internet, and I hate laziness in students, and it's not right. But I read a paper from a Chinese colleague that changed my view on plagiarism. What she said was, plagiarism is practically never about laziness. It's about fear. As you know, when you're working in a second language, or third or fourth language, and you've got to write in that language, you sometimes think, well, that person said it so much better than I could, so I'll put it in, and then it's much clearer what I want to say. And you know, that's how we write computer programs now. You know, when I started, you wrote the computer program. You don't write a computer program now. You find the code that someone else has written for that bit of the program, and you find another bit of code, and then you sew them together. That's how programming goes on now. And it's incredibly difficult in computer science to find out whether someone's plagiarized or not when they've got a task, because the code is all out there. But this person did gain her degree, and she had, you know, it was a very painful and humiliating experience. You know, you have to be interviewed by the dean and kind of difficult stuff. But we did support her, but she was in a face-to-face course. She was a great contributor in class, an experienced teacher, very thoughtful, very caring. She did value coloured paper handouts with a less strong contrast than black on white. But all we did was yellow paper, really, most of the time. But we gave her a lot of general support. I think the most important thing, and this is very hard to quantify, but I still think it was important, was helping her to feel that we understood that she had a problem, and we recognised that she had a problem. It wasn't so much about saying, this is how we solve it, but recognising that she had a challenge, and that we respected that she was dealing with that, in itself was very important. And by contrast, Tim has had, there are some similarities, his dyslexia recognised by the university. The course that he's been on is a blended learning course, so there were 2 face-to-face weekends early on in the course. Each was 2 days long. So if you'd done a master's part-time, as I did as a school teacher, driving 25 miles, and then doing your course, driving back, preparing lessons the next day, you don't get to know your tutors. If you have, by contrast, had 2 two-day weekends with your tutor, you get to know the students well, the tutor is known well by the students, so that's a good thing. But this student sent the tutor an independent report, and I couldn't believe what I saw. Would you choose to send your tutor information that says, I have an IQ of 105 and a reading age of 12, when you are doing a master's degree? Sorry. I don't think he realised quite what he was doing. I didn't feel, oh, the poor guy has serious dyslexia. I thought, how the hell did he get a degree in the first place? That was the first thing I thought. He's got second-class honours from a university in my country. And I thought, with a reading age of 12, that is difficult to understand. I mean, if he'd got a maths degree, maybe, you know, on the Einstein principle, if we believe Einstein was indeed dyslexic, which is problematic. But he'd got a drama degree. However, this is what makes me confident in saying he's in the L- group. I'm very confident in saying that. So he does get tutor support, he does use text-to-speech, but he has very severe difficulties in meeting M-level criteria. He's failed coursework and is redoing coursework so far, and of course there's been a lot of support, and I'm not in a position to tell you the end of the story because it's ongoing. But at the same time, it is a real case, so I think we can connect that up with some of our knowledge. So this is my final slide. Looking to the future, and of course we're all doing that, and it's a very important part of what we're doing here over the next couple of days. What I said to Tim is, how much reading do you do? Because one thing I know as a teacher is, not only do you learn to read by reading, you learn to spell by reading, and you learn to write by reading. You learn the structures of a good sentence by reading. And I said, how much reading have you done in the last 10 years? And he said, actually, I've been a ski instructor for the last 10 years, and I've occasionally read the newspaper. Now, if you contrast that with Mavra, who was teaching every day in a special school and working with text and working with kids, there's a massive difference there. So I think better text-to-speech software would help the L- student. So I think that's a challenge for us. The other area that I think is a massive one is what I call critical internet literacy. And I think it's relevant for 9-year-olds, and it's relevant for 29-year-olds, or for all of us. And I don't think we teach it. I think in my country, there's a massive moral panic about the internet. Will kids be safe? Will there be internet trolls? Will there be bad people trying to get girls or boys and do bad things with them? I think critical internet literacy, judging whether a website is trustworthy or not, is as big a problem. And we need to think about how we teach that, assessing relevance, trustworthiness, teaching people how to generate better search terms, which I think is very much a challenge. And also saying, how do we encourage more collaborative and social learning? From my perspective, in the UK, there's been a Vygotskian revolution in the last 15 years. People are much more interested in learning as a social, psychological activity. But I don't think we've got very far in answering the question, how does that change our pedagogy? How many of our final year grades permit students to submit collaborative work? Very few. Some do, but maybe I need to not go on to that one right now. I think there are some very, very good intelligent writing support tools. You've looked at them, you've worked with them. In my country, Ginger, which looks at the sentence you're trying to write, does a grammatical analysis and offers corrections to you. And Co-Writer, which again is very intelligent, it predicts the word you might want to be saying next and offers you choices, and then you just click on the choice. They're very good pieces of software, very complex, very intelligent. Those, I think, are some of the areas where we might be working, but I know you will have others, and between us, I'm sure, we're working on many others. So I hope some of that is of interest to you. I'm sure some of it will have been provocative, and I look forward to, over the next day or two, having some conversations with you about it. Thank you very much.
I assume there will be some questions.
I have one question regarding the law problems of the online video presentation that are recorded.
Okay.
Because at our university,
Okay.
it's in Brno in Czech Republic, we had
Yeah.
all the courses, the Faculty of Informatics are recorded and
Yeah.
offered for students to be able to watch the presentation again at home and to
Yeah, yeah.
or if he's ill, he can watch it. And there were some problems of misusing the video data, and the students were making fun of professors and from teachers and from lecturers.
Yeah.
So there was a problem that they wanted to stop the recording because of some privacy and some law stuff that the students were not responsible enough to deal with the video only for their personal needs, but they had they wanted to misuse the videos.
I absolutely understand what you're saying. What I feel happens is that the internet enables people to externalize what's happening in their heads. When I was talking, I felt I was in the presence of a group of people who, for the most part, were listening attentively. What was going on in your heads? The answer is all kinds of things, some of which had nothing to do with this afternoon. We have, when I worked in Virginia Tech, I worked in a graduate center which was off campus, and the business school had simultaneous lecture. A guy was in the lecture theatre in Blacksburg, Virginia, lecturing to 30 students who were thoughtful and attentive and looked intelligently plugged into what was happening. And in Northern Virginia were the students also doing an MBA, a business master's degree, who were watching simultaneously. Those guys had their feet up, they were eating their hot dogs, drinking beer, and you needed a bleeper to bleep out their thoughtful and intelligent comments on the lecturer's lecture. So this is in a group context. They were saying, he doesn't know what he's talking about. They had a conversation. They externalized the conversation. When you were thinking, he doesn't know what he's talking about, you didn't say it, but many of you, or most of you, will have thought that at some point. Or I completely disagree, whatever. You had a conversation with me that I, mercifully, in some cases, didn't hear. But when you do it online, you do hear it. I was asked to do a lecture in Cambridge once, in the summer school for English teachers on reading development in high school level. And I gave this lecture to 200 people, lots of applause, wine in the common room afterwards, interesting conversations, thank you Dr. Harrison, da-di-da-di-da. The next year they said, with courses running again, can you do it again? And I was away. And so I said, I'll video it. I made a video of the same lecture, and he showed the lecture. And I saw the guy who'd done it a few months later, and I said, how was the lecture? He said it was great, but he said we actually didn't get to the end of it. He said about 10 minutes in, somebody said, I completely disagree with that. Then someone else said, I agree with your disagreeing, and then someone else disagreed with the disagreement, and then they started talking about it, and the lecture never finished, because that's what happens. Now what I'm saying is all of that is externalizing what's happening anyway. But and you know, you've got to live with that. You know, if someone takes my lecture, mine are online now. If someone, you know, puts it online and, you know, puts a Katy Perry video onto my voice or whatever, or does whatever they think is amusing, That's what's going to happen. The question is, has anyone learned from it? It's still a lecture. And my kid, who's at uni now, does find it valuable to go back to some of those lectures because, you know, you don't understand things the first time. But I think the question of externalizing, I think we have to get more used to it. You know, I have students now, you know, I tell students, turn their phones on, you can Google anything, you can do anything you like in my lecture. You can do your email if you want to. All that's happening is that, you're externalizing things that have been happening forever. I don't invite you to do your email, but if you do that, I won't be pleased, but I won't stop you from doing it. And I said, but you can certainly Google. And I just, you know, a student put a hand up and said, actually, Colin, 10 years ago, you wrote a paper in which you said the opposite of what you just said. And I said, thank you for that. Can I talk to you about why I've changed my view on that? And it was just so helpful that she was able to do that. But, you know, if in my first year teaching at master's level, if somebody said that, you know, I wouldn't have been ready for it. I'd wanted to run out the room. But I'm either braver or more stupid. What have I missed where you thought he should have talked about so-and-so? Maybe it's a 1 glass of wine or 2 glass of wine question.
Is that possible to say from my view, I really appreciated this complementary view for you as a university teacher, how you see the online offerings, in particular for dyslexic students. So that's how I learned, because I also got sensitized through that project and thinking how I would deal with people who are struggling readers. And somehow the limitations of the pure online offerings again lead me back to my very much liking a blended mode where you are face-to-face and online, so you can very, very thoughtfully pick the best medium for whatever is there, and providing students with lots of freedom on how to combine and do some more individualistic learning. So this was more confirming of tendencies that I like to be like as a teacher. So, thank you. And another, hopefully just brief question, you said that those L+ type of dyslexia, that they are ahead in language comprehension. And I understood that from your telling example from reading from the Bible. But is there also any research how one could find out or measure that they are ahead in language comprehension? Just a few words.
Yeah, I think my friends in America who don't like the use of the word dyslexia are unhappy about it because they feel it's almost used in a racist way. What they say is, show me a black kid who is dyslexic. In America, they'll say, no, the poor kids, they're just poor readers. You know, in the ghetto, they're poor readers. No one says, oh, they're dyslexic, they need help, they need an extra computer. And you know, the parody version of dyslexia is a doctor's child who can't read. And people said that to me when I was a young teacher, with the intention being that it was humorous. But there's a sense in which it's right. If you say there's a phonology problem, and that's what I would use the term I would use dyslexia for. Some of those people with that issue have had lots of language development, lots of vocabulary from birth, lots of language interaction. They've had stories read to them from age 1. their vocabulary is going to be better, their comprehension is going to be better. And those are some of the ones who become your L1. So I think that the challenge is to say they're not just middle-class kids who are being preferentially treated. They are kids from whatever background who have had that very rich language environment, but who still have a phonology processing problem. And I think that group is out there. I think if you said to Maggie Snowling, you know, does your data identify those kind of students? I think she would say unequivocally that it does. But the trick is to try and find a way of describing it that doesn't appear to be classist or racist.
Thank you. Enormously many factors.
Hey.
Yeah.
I just had a practical question. I think you've acknowledged, even now and again, that there are different kinds of people with different sources of reading problems. And one could come just as, say, someone who grows up in the ghetto and no one ever read them a story, or their parents are illiterate. In immigrant societies, I come from Israel, there are kids like that in classes. They're gravely disadvantaged because their homes don't provide them two professor parents who read them stories from when they're 6 months old. They have nobody to do their homework with them. They have no one to read them stories. The vocabulary that they hear is more like 700 utterances a day rather than 11,000. Okay, so you know there's different backgrounds to poor reading. I'm wondering if a portal like the one we've been working on for 3 years can somehow make up for that difference, which is basically not that they're somehow born with some issue, but they're put into a background that gave them poorer reading skills.
Yeah. I think it can. I would stick by my earlier statement of saying that the only real way to become a better reader is to read. I truly believe that, because that's the only way in which fluency will increase, reading, word recognition will increase, is through more reading. But in order for that to happen, a number of things need to change. You need to feel that someone cares about you. You need to feel that there is hope and the possibility of change. And so the stories that we were valuing earlier this afternoon are enormously important. And even though I think, you know, the Einstein one, I don't think that's terribly helpful, because, you know, even with help, we're not going to become Einstein. But stories of people like us that say I have been helped and I've changed, kind of evangelical stories, do help. And we do know, and those of you that work with long term with kids who have a problem, who haven't got a serious psychological block, you know, in terms of behaviour and so on, really do change. And when, I think there are two transition points. One is when you get to about the reading age of an average 9-year-old, which is the point at which you can begin to read on your own, and the point at which the words you are reading are from a larger set than your spoken vocabulary. That happens around age 9. That's a big transition point. If you get people up to that, then they can begin to be independent readers. And then there's another step change around the reading age of an average 13 or 14-year-old. And if you can get people up to that, it makes a big difference. When you say to, are you disagreeing? Visually, I wondered whether you were. I mean, I'm saying there's a kind of takeoff point. If you can get a teenage kid who's behind in reading, starting to read fan fiction, for example, you know, Harry Potter is incredibly difficult to read. Harry Potter is not easy reading. A poor reader, aged 9, 10, 11 or 12, who likes the Harry Potter characters, may well not be able to read the books. They're quite challenging. It's not Goethe, but they are quite challenging. But the fan fiction on the internet, there are 600,000 Harry Potter stories on the internet in fan fiction, and a lot of those are more easy to read. And getting kids reading something at that level can I think make a big difference. And then that can transition a kid who, if you like, who is on the cusp of L minus to L plus. It can move them from L minus to L plus. If they're on the kind of line, that practice can move them up. That's what I think. That's my experience as a teacher.
Thank you.
But yeah, motivation, support, recognition, as well as all the tools, and then reading practice.
One short last question, then we should...
I don't know if it's a short question. You mentioned this value in face-to-face teaching and online teaching. You said people online feel more free to discuss it and so on. Do you believe that online teaching only could work well? I'm just working with some people who are just putting together some project with the virtual teacher who would somehow take a feedback of emotional reaction of students and so on and so forth. Do you think it's feasible, or are you hesitant to?
What I would say is, I believe increasingly in a kind of Bakhtin or Vygotskian perspective, which would say that learning comes through dialogue. Now, there are plenty of examples of people who have learned just through books, and have had dialogues with the author, and as a result of that, if you like, have become scholars and massively wise. So my question in relation to your course is that it can't be answered independently of looking at the structure of the course and asking the question, what kind of conversations does that course structure invite? And what happens if the learner doesn't learn from this conversation? The advantage of peer learning is that you can have alternate conversations with people who are closer to your own level of understanding. If your only conversation is with a teacher who is incapable of adjusting their discourse to your level, then the online learning may not work. If you have online tools or resources that offer alternative conversations so that, if you like, the student can get to their the incoming information or part of the conversation, part of the dialogue, can connect with their zone of proximal development, then it will work. But there's got to be some flexibility built in. But there isn't a structural problem, in my view, but equally you can't make a general statement without saying what's the nature of the interaction that's invited. But I don't think there's a structural problem that would say an L- student cannot learn from an online course. But the things I was trying to say on my final slide would say these are some of the ways in which we might work on the area to offer things. But there are some things can't be made simple. But on the other hand, Bruner's view of learning was a kind of spiral. A spiral curriculum, and he would disagree. He would say there isn't anything that can't be taught at some level. So I think, well, I know someone who works at CERN, and I've tried to ask that person what they do, and beyond the first sentence, it's very difficult for me to understand him and for him to find a second sentence that I can understand. But I think for most things, and certainly in most school contexts, certainly in the kind of thing we're doing, talking about, you know, master's level course in education, I think there's an awful lot that could be presented in ways that are palatable and staged that would help our L- person.